Welcome back to MBE. I'm here to go over what goes into porting a manifold. There's a lot more that goes into it than you see from the naked eye. When you receive it ported, you go, okay, it doesn't look like much work was done. For instance, we do CNC some manifolds, but a lot of the manifolds that we do, they become so specific that we want to make a small change here or there. So it makes it very difficult to redo all the CAD and to machine one manifold for each specific engine. In other words, if you have a Big Chief motor, these are Big Chief style manifolds here that run 8200, or you have one that runs 9500, or you have one that runs 7800. All of those that's three completely different manifolds. The runner lengths will be different, the plenum volumes will be different, the size of the runners will be different, up and down and width. So there's a lot more that goes into it. So certainly a lot of thought goes into each one. So for instance, on these, we start off, the openings are very, very small. If we come over here, it's probably a 1/2 inch in width, as you can see here. And then we have to decide how we're going to go in there and manipulate this and still have, we need line of sight to the plenum. If it has line of sight to the plenum, then it'll have signal to the booster of the carburetor, and then it'll be easier to square jet it. Because you want this runner to have the same signal as the center runner. This way the engine runs in the same, it's much easier to get your O2s correct this way. Or EGTs if you're old school. And when you go up and down, it's very similar to that 1/2 inch. I mean, there's a lot of time goes into this. A manifold like this will have over 40 hours in. And by opening all the runners up from here, that allows us to come in here from this side after we've done that. It allows us to do a few things. Well, for one, we can narrow the floor up, because now we'll bring this through. We'll decide if we want to narrow the floor up or if we want to narrow it up here, and that'll be dictated by how we set it up as far as at the flange up and down. So now the floor is much narrower than the one over here. It's somewhat hard to see, but it certainly is narrower. A wide manifold never really works that good. They're never happy when they're wide. But you can be too narrow also. But it allows us to do that. And then, as we're porting it, these manifolds typically have large hooks in these runners right here. And anytime we can make this straighter, these runners straighter without a hook, the motor likes it. The motor would rather have this straight and make a turn at the cylinder head, pulling the charge in here, than having a nice big radius hook. If we had a nice big radius here that went all the way in here, the motor would not run as good. I know it's surprising to hear that, but the dyno and the track prove that. Okay, so during that process, when we go back in the plenum volume, we're going to shorten the runners, narrow the floor, and this way we can have the correct plenum volume. So we'll have measurements that we do from here to here that we decide on. We'll have measurements here to here depending on the cubic inch and RPM. The width of the runners will be dictated by the cubic inch and RPM on both the ends and everything. This is a fairly decent design manifold. This would be something that was copied from the Cup stuff. So this would be like to us, we look at it, this is kind of like a 671 SB2 manifold on steroids. Okay, or 617, I mean. So it has line of sight to the end runners, you can see, because it has to, I promise you, I bring this up so often because the line of sight is so important to make sure that when the charge is brought through, the piston comes down, it pulls the charge in, that it has the same amount of signal to the booster as the straight runners, as the short runners do. The more efficient we can do that, making the end runners flow as much as the centers, the happier the engine is, because it's running in the same fuel curve. The fuel curve is much more correct. So as we go back in the plenum, we're shortening these dividers. We shorten these dividers, we pull this back, And as we pull this back, it gets this runner closer to the same length as the center runners. So we always try to pull this divider back right here. And this will be pulled back some. And when we pull those back, you can see we do not use large radiuses. You know, that might look like a sharp radius, but it's not. You know, I mean, we like a sharper radius. The reason why we want a sharper radius is because as the charge is pulled in, piston comes down, it pulls the charge in, okay? So with the larger radius, as the air goes into the runner, what happens is with the larger radius pushes the air and it comes together much further up the intake manifold. So as the engine speeds get higher, the cubic inch gets higher. Those are the two things that are going to create more airspeed. As those get higher, we need smaller radiuses, and this allows that to go further in. It's a complete opposite that you would think. You would think, oh, larger radius, it'll keep it attached longer, but it does not. You want a smaller radius so it'll stay attached. It'll stay attached much further down the port. And you'll see Pro Stock engines, you know, NHRA Pro Stock engines were probably the first to realize this, that the smaller radius helps so much. It helps it pull fuel, helps it accelerate. It just helps all of that. So then from there, you know, the carb flange is designed specific to your carb spacer, or the carb spacer that we offer, or your carburetor person offers, or your fuel injection that you're using. You know, all of that is made specific to what you're supplying us. So that's another reason why going here and CNCing is not always the best option. You know, having quality people do this correctly for each one is what's important. Okay, so as we're looking at the intake manifold plenum volumes, we always want to remember we're not dividing the intake manifold by 8 because it has 8 runners. We only pull in one charge at a time. So each charge, this is just a reservoir of air is what this is. Think of it as a reservoir. The piston comes down, pulls the charge. If this reservoir is not large enough, it won't make any power. It'll only make power up to a certain RPM. So we can dictate how much more RPM you can move this. We can move the RPM. I can make this thing peak at, I can make a 632. We can make a peak at 5,500 if we wanted, or we can make a peak at, let's say, 7,500. You know, to do that though takes a lot more material to do. But always remember, we do not divide by 8. This is just a reservoir to help pull the charge in. And I hope that explains a little bit more of what goes into this. Like I said, a manifold like this is over 40 hours. And we're just not going in there and just polishing. There's a lot of design that goes into it, a lot of thought that goes into it. And that's why you'll have guys that'll do manifolds for $1,200, but I am sure you will get a $1,200 job, because who in their right mind would want to port one of these manifolds and spend 50 hours in it for $1,200? I do not know, because it's very, very difficult. But when we do these manifolds, typical one of these is $1,800. It's not much more money. We probably do twice as much work than a $1,200 guy, and the results are significant. So I hope this answers most of your questions on the manifold. I hope you got something out of this, and thanks again for visiting.